and welcome. This time we come to the 30th Sunday of the year, and this of course is the year of Luke, and so the gospel this time is from Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. The opening reading is from the book of Sirach, chapter 35, verses 12 through 14, and verses 16 through 18. And again, the second letter attributed by Paul to Timothy, chapter 4, verses 6 through 8, and verses 16 through 18. All right. Actually, the gospel this time picks up the verses from our discussion last time. And this parable, by the way, brings to a close the uniquely Lucan portion of what is known as the travel narrative. Remember that this narrative began way back in chapter 9, verses 51, and now concludes, keep in mind here, chapter 18. So this particular development within the Lucan tradition is one of the longest, and it is, as we've noticed on many occasions, that in this gospel the writer likes to use the imagery of journey. So in this case, the journey, which began in the north, in the Galilee, is now moving toward Jerusalem, and the material that's included here in this section, which is considerable as we have noticed over the weeks, now comes to a conclusion. This time we hear a parable, or a story if you want, between a Pharisee and a toll collector, sometimes translated as tax collector. There was a distinction between the two. A tax collector probably had a wider range of things that he was engaged with. A toll collector would more likely deal with a roll that you had to pass, much like if you're on the thruway and you pay the toll tax or fee. So that depending here again how you want to translate this. All right, so both of these men are pictured as being in the temple in Jerusalem, where they have come to pray. Now it is true, and we have heard many stories, of course, about those who have something to do with the temple. The temple in Jerusalem could be a place where people at any time could go to pray. So it wasn't just that people came to Jerusalem or to the temple for one of the three significant communal times, remember, and we have noticed how often going up for Passover or Pentecost would have been occasions, but people could go to pray in the temple area. Usually it was open 2 times a day for public prayer. Namely, it would be open at 3 a.m. to 9 a.m. and from 9 to 3 p.m. So there were certain times in which people were, now you're saying, weren't they back to back? Well, not exactly. But when people could certainly go into the temple area to pray. Now we've noticed on many occasions, keep in mind, I don't have the picture here again this time, but the temple area, you had the temple building in the center, you had the court of the men around that temple, and then you had the court of what was known as the court of the women or the court of the Gentiles. So where did men go? Well, men would go to pray in the court of men, all right? So just to keep in mind that there was a certain space in which this took place. Now, when they prayed, where did they face? Well, one assumes they face toward the entrance into the temple itself. And there was an altar there, which the priest used for sacrifice at certain times of the year. All right, so we have talked about and shown, I hope, going back, although we didn't bring them this time, some pictures of what the temple would look like. All right, so you have two figures here. You have the Pharisee. The Pharisee who's pictured as standing kind of up front and making his prayer. Now, in his prayer, interestingly, he says, "Well, I thank God I'm not like the others, or especially like that Pharisee, that toll collector back there." Now, the Pharisees, and I guess we want to develop a little bit that the Pharisees are often pictured as kind of bad guys, but in many ways the Pharisees were really quite good and quite noble witnesses. The Pharisees were teachers. That, of course, was essentially their role. The Pharisees often brought together people who did not live in the temple area. So, for example, in the Galilee, the Pharisees were often kind of the prayer leaders, okay? And they developed certain practices which they thought would be helpful, and themselves were engaged in. They argued for the idea of righteousness, which would be a right relationship with God, and that the ultimate goal of good relationship with God would be happiness. And for example, later on, or earlier on, one of the more important Pharisees who writes these wonderful letters turned out to be Paul. Paul had said that I had been trained and raised as a Pharisee. So they were teachers, but they also developed certain customs or practices that would be kind of worth looking at, or even for some as emulating. For example, they developed a custom of fasting. Now, fasting in Israeli life, really only requirement for fasting, we may have mentioned this earlier on, was one time a year, on the day of Yom Kippur, which all Israel was asked to fast. But the Pharisees developed the practice of, during the regular week, of fasting. And so for 2 days each in any week, they would fast. And that was a kind of noble action. Now, did they encourage others to do the same? Yes. Did others have to do the same? No. But if you were a Pharisee and a teacher, you probably pushed this idea a little bit stronger than you might have suspected, all right? So the Pharisee is found as standing here. He begins by saying, now this, of course, is what some will find as problematic with the Pharisee prayer. And notice that he is praying here. I thank you, God, he said, and points out that he prays. Well, there is, and I kind of interject here, a prayer that was found in the Tosefta, Tosephta, which goes this way. Now, we're not quite sure whether this was already in effect in the time of Jesus, but certainly was very close to it. And this is the way this prayer or praise every day was made. It's called the three praises each day. First of all, praise be the Lord, that he has not made me a heathen, for all heathen are as nothing before him. Praised be he who did not make me a woman, for a woman is not under obligation to fulfill the law. And praised be he who did not make me an uneducated man, for the uneducated man is not cautious to avoid sin. Well, now that's one of the kind of understandings of prayer and praise that was developed by the Pharisee. I suppose, that the second one of those would be kind of objected to by some of the women in our time, and maybe even in the time of Jesus. All right? So he prays, and he tells God. Now, this is, of course, what is important here to notice about the Pharisee and why there's some concern here with him. He thanks God for the gifts that he has. Now, he doesn't mention that these gifts were given to him, but rather somehow that he has them. I fast, he says. I pay the tithes. Now, that's important. Keep in mind, particularly ask your local pastor about this, okay? And what were the tithes that were expected and that the Pharisee was engaged in? Well, in offering, this was what the tithes were, the first fruits of the produce, okay? Did he do that? Well, he seems to think the practice that he was doing. So all of that, in one way you say, well, he says, I do these kind of things. But in another way, he is leading a kind of good life. He pays the tithes. He gives the gifts that are necessary. He fasts, etc. So isn't he, by his life, perhaps offering some kind of model that other fellow Hebrews might well follow? The other character who is developed here is the tax collector or the toll collector. Now, where does he, in the area of prayer here, he stands, that is the tax collector, stands apart from the Pharisee to begin with, and it looks like he's standing more in the back of the prayer place than up in the front. But it certainly indicates a separation that he has from the Pharisee and himself. The law-observant Jews would considered to be enriched by greedy, sinful, dishonest quisling of Rome. So all of that would be a way to look at what the tax collector was. He was not a good guy, and he was working for the oppressors of the people, namely Rome, and so that's why you kept your distance from him. And the prayer, just to point out that of the prayer of the toll collector or the tax collector is simply a call for mercy. So he doesn't articulate all the things that he does or doesn't do, but he simply is asking for God's mercy. Now, what were these taxes or tithes? And we have both of them here mentioned. As I said a couple minutes ago, you had the annual offering of the first fruits of the produce. You also had the tithing that was used, and technically it indicated a tenth of everything. Whether or not that was always strictly enforced, we don't know. And that was used to support the priests and the Levites. And The purpose of these tithes was to keep things flowing in a orderly and kind of interesting way. And what was a concern here, so when the Romans came and enforced the laws, that their taxes turned out to be somewhat exorbitant. All right, now the tax agent, call him the toll agent, call him, had specific, how did this work? And I think we mentioned this before, but this is the general way in which often it happened. Those who purchased the right from the government to collect specific taxes. So in order to get this job, you had to get the approval of the government, and supposedly here would be the Romans. Secondly, that there were supervising officials, regional directors. So tax collector just didn't work by himself, but there were others who kind of watched what was going on or what was not going on that should have been taking place. Now, the employees or the agents who collected indirect taxes through tolls, and as I mentioned, tolls, if he was a toll collector, and this is why you can kind of make an interesting discussion here. If he was a toll collector, then it had to do with roads of some kind and the passage of goods from one side of the road to the next. Often these tolls would be goods that were coming from the east, and then they would come into the Galilee, and then they would go down Israel's way and enter into Egypt, where, of course, there was a good market for much of the goods that were being transported. So there is the job of the toll collector. As we mentioned, depending on who the collector was, and depending on how the system worked. Now, sometimes the toll collector was told at the beginning of a season, this would be more the tax collector, we expect that is the government, so much in terms of taxes. You got to get it, okay? So he would, some say he even gave the money ahead of time, but give the money that was required by the government, and then he would distribute the bill to the various fellow Israelites and include in the process a salary for himself. So, for example, if the tax bill were $10, he would say to the person who he gave it to was $12. Therefore, he would keep the $2, and that was the way in which he would make his money. So now there's, again, today, a little bit of background of the Pharisees and of the toll collector. All right. Now the Pharisee's prayer, as we noticed, was one of gratitude to God, enabling him to keep the law and to go beyond its stipulations. He sees himself as separate from others, particularly from those who are unjust and seeking to make money for themselves, and particularly for those who usurp the prerogatives of God in trying to make a profit and income for their own. So how does Jesus conclude this? Well, he concludes it by saying, these two men went home. Now, someone has pointed out, did these two men go home together? It just says that they left. Keep in mind that the Pharisees didn't run things up in the temple. They, like the publican or the toll collector, were just part of the people of Israel. but he had come up to pray, and they both pray, and do they go home together? So again, we don't know, although in the process of praying, they don't stand, and in the temple, they don't stand with one another. But nevertheless, you don't know. Jesus says, one went home justified and the other did not. Well, we presume that it is the tax collector who goes home justified. But interestingly, here are some questions that are raised. Will the tax collector act on the mercy and justification that he has been given? Will he change his way of doing things? Or will he continue to work as a tax collector, where it is easy to fall into corruption and mercilessness? So has he been doing this? He says he's sorry, but is he going right back to do it again? Interesting how people will say, oh, I'm sorry, and then, oh, never mind, okay. Will he make restitution to those he has wronged, as he has taken advantage of fellow Israelites by charging a little extra or more than he should? Is he going to now say, oh, I'm sorry? But real sorrow would be in giving back some of the unearned money that he'd taken from them. Is he going to do this? We don't know. It's an unanswered question. Would it even be possible for him to find all the people whom he needs to make amends to? So as wonderful as my idea is that he would go and say, look here, Joe, here, Jonah, here, I'm sorry. So many he didn't even know. So those remain really unanswered questions as to whether or not the toll collector who receives the mercy of God is going to be so quick in returning or stopping, either way, the actions that he has been done. Is either one of the characters, and this would be a question we might be asked as we hear the story this time, a person to be emulated by us? Should the Pharisee be emulated because he's a wonderful model of prayer, fasting, and tithing? Well, certainly you could say, yeah, that would be good qualities that the reader, or in this case, the listener, could do. Or is the tax collector who makes his prayer his ability to change his actions? Is that something that we should notice? He is forgiven, but he could act differently. Or are neither of them presented as models to be followed by the reader or the listener? So you can take your choice on this one. As I say, the Pharisee's prayer is self-focused. That isn't necessarily wrong, self-focused, because Luke has presented other stories in this gospel where people make a prayer that's self-focused. For example, the beautiful Magnificat of Mary, when she is announced by the angel Gabriel to be the mother of God, says a beautiful prayer in which she indicates what she will do and how God has blessed her, etc. So, and Simeon's prayer also, remember, when Jesus is presented in the temple by his parents, he says, "Now, Lord, you may dismiss your servant, for I have seen the glory of the Lord." Well, again, that is self-focused. So in and of itself, the idea of self-focusedness may not be so wrong. So I leave it up to you as to which of these two figures is the one that we should avoid being, or which of them we should maybe emulate. As I mentioned, Keep in mind that we have had a tradition of finding the Pharisee always as something wrong, and it is true in Luke's story that the tension between Jesus and the Pharisee, particularly on this journey, has been rather strong. But nevertheless, the qualities, the practices that are enabling the Pharisee to be who he is are worth kind of paying attention to. The first reading comes from the book of Sirach, which is part, as you remember, of what is known as the wisdom tradition of ancient Israel. And the wisdom tradition is in some ways very different from the prophetic tradition. We often have many readings from the prophets. And my point here is that the prophets often speak their measure to fellow Israelites. If you do this, God will bless us. If we stop this, God will be happy and will bless us. But many times the message or the role of the prophets is to Israel and excluding outsiders. The wisdom of Sirach has pictures. God is saying, God knows no favorites, that therefore everyone should be included or can be included in the graciousness of the Creator. So these verses indicate, and we just get this little bit of Sirach here, as I point out, very practical, by the way. The wisdom tradition, and maybe that's in some ways why Luke would even like that, as wonderful as kind of having idealized ideas or hopes or expectations, the wisdom tradition is very practical. For example, he, in one case, says, look, you have a widow, but a widow can remarry. You have an orphan, but an orphan could be adopted. You have one who loses his status in life, but he can regain it. So you see, the Sirach writer says it doesn't have to stay that way necessarily, that there can be and are opportunities or occasions in which things change and come to the better. So as you look at, we often get little sections from Sirach. The wisdom of Sirach is a wisdom that applies to and can encompass everyone, not just one little group. Maybe Catholics need to look at that. So the wisdom of God is not just for us, but for everyone. All right? And finally, a word. We have not spoken too much about the second reading, which is pictured as Paul writing to Timothy. Remember that Timothy and Titus were two disciples of Paul. And Paul here is pictured as the reading begins today, suggests to Timothy that his days are numbered, that his death is imminent. And he says that his life will be poured out as a kind of drinking offer. The image, I think here, although it's not too well developed, except by interpreters, is pouring out like pouring wine out. It represents a substitute for the pouring of blood, which in the book of Numbers is the way in which offerings were made to God. So I just mentioned that opening part of the work of Paul to Timothy. But as we pointed out, the writings, three letters rather, that go to Paul and Titus are probably what we would call Pauline letters. That's another long discussion. They are known as the pastoral letters. They picture Paul certainly as a great hero, and perhaps that's why the New Testament does like him. Well, may our prayer be certainly the prayer of the toll collector, that the Lord's mercy and kindness be with us and that we share it with others. Thank you for being with us and hope to see you again.